all that bullshit. And the world has a record of it. Terrible.
No, you didn't. We're just live now, so you're okay. Your
Oh, okay,
secret
perfect.
is safe with me.
Okay. So the world, at least now the world knows that possibly there's something interesting about me.
Yeah,
Yeah, in the
exactly.
in the
Between
background. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Let's
we
do this.
have we're going to now move on to the transcendental doctrine of elements, the first chapter in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. This is good. I'm really looking forward to this because every sort of big daddy in philosophy has read Kant, so we got to read
Yeah,
Kant.
we have to.
Okay, transcendental doctrine of elements, and if my internet is a bit dodgy, just we'll have to truck through it. Okay, transcendental aesthetic. In
Oh
whatever
shit.
manner and well,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
in whatever manner and whatever means a mode of knowledge may relate to objects, intuition is that through which it is in immediate relation to them, and from which all thought gains its material. But intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. This again is only possible to man, at least insofar as the mind is affected in a certain way. The capacity, receptivity, for receiving representations through the mode in which we are affected by objects is entitled sensibility. Objects are given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone yields intuitions. They are thought through the understanding, and from the understanding arise concepts. But all thought must directly or indirectly, by way of certain characters, relate ultimately to intuitions, and therefore, with us, to sensibility, because in no other way can an object be given to us. The effect of an object upon the faculty of representation, so far as we are affected by it, is sensation. That intuition which is in relation to the object through sensation is entitled empirical. The undetermined object of an empirical intuition is entitled appearance. That in the appearance which corresponds to sensation, I term is matter, but that which so determines the manifold of appearance that it allows of being ordered in certain relations, I term the form of appearance, that in which alone the sensations can be posited and an order and ordered in a certain form, cannot itself be sensations, and therefore while the matter of all appearance is given to us a posteriori, only its form must lie ready for the sensations a priori in the mind, and so must allow of being considered apart from all sensation. I turn all representation pure in the transcendental sense, in which there is nothing that belongs to sensation. The pure form of sensible intelligence in general, in which all the manifold of intuition is intuited in certain relations, must be found in the mind a priori. This pure form of sensibility may also itself be called pure intuition. If then I take away from the representation of a body that which the understanding thinks in regard to it, substance, force, divisibility, etc., and likewise what belongs to sensation, impenetrability, hardness, color, etc., something still remains over from this empirical intuition, namely extension and figure. These belong to pure intuition, which, even without any actual object of the senses or of the sensation, exists in the mind a priori as a mere form of sensibility. This science of all principles of a priori sensibility I call transcendental aesthetic. Say that again. The science of all principles of a priori sensibility I call transcendental aesthetic. There must be such a science from forming the first part of the transcendental doctrine of elements, in distinction from that part which deals with the principles of pure thought and which is called transcendental logic. In the transcendental aesthetic, we shall therefore first isolate the sensibility by taking it away from it everything which the understanding thinks through its concepts, so that nothing may be left save empirical intuition. Secondly, we shall also separate off from it everything which belongs to sensation, so that nothing may remain save pure intuition and the mere form of appearances, which is all that sensibility can supply a priori. In the course of this investigation, it will be found that there are two pure forms of sensible intuition, serving as principles of a priori knowledge, namely space and time. To the consideration of these we shall now proceed. Transcendental Aesthetic, Section 1, Space, Metaphysical Exposition of this concept. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside of us, and all without exception in space. In space, their shape, magnitude, and relation to one another are determined or determinable. Inner sense, by means of which the mind intuits itself, or its inner state yields indeed to intuition of the soul itself as an object. But there is nevertheless a determinate form, namely time, in which alone the intuition of inner states is possible, and everything which belongs to inner determinations is therefore represented in relations of time. Time cannot be outwardly intuited, any more than space can be intuited as something in us. What then are space and time? Are they real existence? Are they real existence? Are they only terminations or relations of things, yet such as would belong to things even if they were not intuited? Our space and time, much such that they belong only to the form of intuition, and therefore to the subjective constitution of our mind, apart from which they could not be ascribed to anything whatsoever. In order to obtain light on these questions, let us first give an exposition to the concept of space. By exposition, I mean the clear thought, not necessarily exhaustive, representation of that which belongs to a concept. The exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which exhibits the concept as given a priori. 1. Space is not an empirical concept, which has been derived from the experiences. For in order that certain sensations be referred to something outside me, that is, to something in another region of space, from that in which I find myself, and similarly in order that I may be able to represent them as outside and alongside one another, and accordingly as not only different, but as in different places, the representation of space must be presupposed. The representation of space cannot therefore be empirically obtained from the relations of outer space. On the contrary, this outer experience is itself possible at all only through that representation. 2. Space is a necessary a priori representation, which underlies all our intuitions. We never represent to ourselves the absence of space, though we can quite well think of it as empty as objects. It must therefore be regarded as a condition of the possibility of experience, and not a determination dependent upon them. It is an intention which necessarily underlies outer appearance. 3. Space is not a discursive, or as we say, general concept of relations of things in general, but a pure intuition. For in the first place, we can represent to ourselves only one space. And if we speak of diverse spaces, we mean thereby only parts of one and the same unique space. Secondly, these parts cannot precede the one all-embracing space, as being, as it were, constitutes out of which it can be composed. On the contrary, they can be thought only as in space. Is essentially one, the manifold in it, and therefore the general concept of space depends solely on the introduction of limitations. Hence, it follows that an a priori and not an empirical intuition underlies all concepts of space. For kindred reasons, geometrical propositions that, for instance, in a triangle, two sides together are greater than 1/3 can never be derived from the general concepts of line and triangle, but only from intuition, and indeed a priori with apodictic certainty. Okay, now, so what I'm going to do is, as you can see here, there's lines. So I'm just going to read this line, and then I'll come back again to read that other one because it can get pretty confusing. if I'm okay, so here I'm going to read up here. So we have, okay, 4. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now, every concept must be thought as a representation which is contained in an infinite number of different possible representations as their common character, and which therefore contains these under itself. But no concept as such can be thought as containing an infinite number of representations within itself. It is in this latter way, however, that space is thought, for all the parts of space coexist ad infinitum. Consequently, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition and not a concept. Okay, let me come back up here. This section here, so we have two versions of this by Kant. In A, there is here inserted the following argument. 3. The apodictic certainty of all geometrical propositions and the possibility of their a priori construction is grounded in the a priori necessity of space, where this representation of space concept required a posteriori, derived from outer experience in general. The first principles of mathematical determinations would be nothing but perceptions. They would therefore all share in the contingent character of perceptions, that there should be only one straight line between 2 points would not be necessary, but only what experience always teaches. What is derived from experience is only part of universality, namely that which is obtained through induction. We should therefore only be able to say that, for as hitherto observed, no space has been found which has more than 3 dimensions. And then we have this element here, 5. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude, a general conception of space which is found alike in a foot and in a cell, cannot determine anything in general to magnitude. If there are no limitations in the progression of intuition, no concept of relations could yield a principle of their infinitude. Okay, 3. Transcendental exposition of the concept of space. I understand by a transcendental exposition the explanation of a concept as a principle from which the possibility of other a priori synthetic knowledge can be understood. For this purpose, it is required that such knowledge does really flow from the given concept, that this knowledge is possible only on the assumption of a given mode of explaining the concept. Geometry is a science which determines the properties of space synthetically, and yet a priori. What then must be our representation of space in order that such knowledge of it may be possible? It must in its origin be intuition, for from a mere concept no proposition can be obtained which go beyond the concept, as happens in geometry. Further, this intuition must be a priori, that is, it must be found in us prior to any perception of an object, and must therefore be pure, not empirical intuition. For geometrical propositions are one and all apodictic, that is, are bound up with the consciousness of their necessity. For instance, that space has only 3 dimensions. Such positions cannot be empirical, or in other words, judgments of experience, nor can they be derived from any such judgments. How then can there exist in the mind of outer intuition, which precedes the objects themselves, and in which the concepts of these objects can be determined a priori, manifestly not otherwise than in so far as the intuition has its seat in the subject only, as the formal character of the subject, in virtue of which, in being affected by objects, it obtains immediate representations, that is, intuitions of them, and only insofar as therefore as it is merely the form of an outer sense in general. Our explanation is thus only the explanation that makes intelligible the possibility of geometry as a body of a priori synthetic knowledge. Any mode of explanation which fails to do this, although it may otherwise seem to be somewhat similar, can be this criterion, be distinguished from it with the greatest certainty. Conclusions from the concepts above. Space A. Space does not represent any property of things in themselves, nor does it represent them in their relation to one another. That is to say, space does not represent any determination that attaches to the objects themselves and which remains even when abstractions has been made of all the subjections of intuition. For no determinations, whether absolute or relative, can be intuited prior to the existence of things to which they belong, and none therefore can be intuited a priori. Space is nothing but the form of all appearances of outer space. It is the subjective conditions of sensibility, under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. Since then, the receptivity of the subject, its capacity to be affected by objects, must necessarily precede all intuitions of these objects. It can readily be understood how the form of all appearances can be given a priori to all actual perceptions, and so exist in the mind a priori, and how a pure intuition in which all objects must be determined. It can contain, prior to all experience, principles which determine the relations of these objects. It is therefore solely from the human standpoint that we speak of space extended things. If we depart from the subjective condition under which alone we can have the outer intuition, namely liability to be affected by objects, the representation of space stands for nothing whatsoever. This predicate can be ascribed to things only insofar as they appear to us, that is, only to objects of sensibility. The constant form of this receptivity, which we term sensibility, is a necessary condition of all relations in which objects can be intuited as outside of us. And if we abstract from these objects, it is a pure intuition and bears the name of space. Since we cannot treat the special conditions of sensibility as conditions of the possibility of things, but only as their appearances, we can indeed say that space comprehends all things that appears to us as external, but not all things in themselves, whatever subject they are intuited, or whether they be intuited or not. For we cannot judge in regard to the intuitions of other thinking beings, whether they be bound by the same conditions as those which limit our intuition and which for us are universally valid. If we add to the concept of the subject of a judgment the limitation under which the judgment is made, the judgment is then unconditionally valid. The proposition that all things are side by side in space is valid under the limitation of these things are viewed as objects of our sensible intuition. If now I add the condition to the concept and say that all things as outer appearances are side by side in space, the rule is valid universally and without limitation. Our exposition, therefore, establishes the reality that that is, the objective validity of space, is represented in respect to whatever can be presented to us outwards as an object, but also at the same time the ideality of space in respect to things when they are considered in themselves through reason. Okay. That is with regard to the constitution of our sensibility. We assert then the empirical reality of space as regards all possible outer experience. Yet at the same time, we assert the transcendental ideality. In other words, that it is nothing at all immediately. We withdraw the above condition, namely its limitation to possible experience, and to look upon it as something that underlies things in themselves. The sole exception of space, there is no subjective representation referring to something outer, which could be entitled at once objective and a priori. For there is no other subjective representation from which we can derive a priori synthetic propositions, as we can from intuitions in space. Strictly speaking, therefore, these other representations have no ideality, although they agree with the representation of space in this respect, that they belong merely to the subjective constitution of our manner of sensibility, for instance, of sight, hearing, touch, as the case of sensations of colour, sounds, and heat, which, since they are mere sensations and not intuitions, do not of themselves yield knowledge of any object, least of all any a priori knowledge. The above remark is intended only to guide anyone from supposing that the ideality of space, as here asserted, can be illustrated by examples. The above remark is intended only to guard anyone from supposing that the ideality of space asserted can be illustrated by examples, so altogether insufficient as colours, taste, etc. For these cannot be rightly regarded as properties of things, but only as changes in the subject, changes which may indeed be different for different men. In such example as these, that which originally is itself only appearances, for instance, a rose, is being treated by the empirical understanding as a thing in itself, which, nevertheless, in respect of its colour, can appear differently to every observer. The transcendental concept of appearance in space, on the other hand, is a critical reminder that nothing intuited in space is a thing in itself, that space is not a form of inhering in things in themselves, as their intrinsic property, that objects in themselves are quite unknown to us, and that what we call outer objects are nothing but mere representations of our sensibility, the form of which is space, the true correlate of sensibility. The thing in itself is not known and cannot be known through these representations, and in experiences, no question is ever asked in regard to it. Okay, just give me 1 second. Where did I put this goddamn thing? Forgot to plug in my computer. So here we go. So any thoughts, Jason?
Oh man, it's very interesting how it's very systematic.
It's very systematic. It's like he's throwing you his dictionary in the first paragraph, which is amazing.
Yeah. He's really laying things out. I like how space is one. There's like a manifold that you think there are this space is that space, but it's really one space.
No. It's space that's coming from us. I mean, I've spent months going through this in Bristow's book, The Critique of Hegel and the Philosophical Transformation of Critique. I think that's roughly the title of the book. But anyway, yes. So what we have here is we've so many Kantian concepts here. We have intuition, thought, concepts, appearances. And
what do you think he means when he says aesthetics? Like, is that some kind of it refers to like a sensibility that we have that's not questioned or something, like just a tendency, I guess.
That's a very good point. I think it just might be some Kantian. I have my Sebastian Gardner book, but I don't know. I think it's somewhere else. Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll keep that question because that's a good one.
Yeah.
Was there anything else that hit you immediately in the first section?
Yeah. He explicitly says that the thing in itself is not.
Yeah.
It's not to be reached. So it's interesting how early this type of thing.
Yeah. And
it's really in the beginning of stuff.
So we have intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So intuition takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. Intuition is that through which the immediate relation to them and from which all thought is material. So intuition is a really important.
Mm-hmm.
Intuition is that through which the immediate. Go on, yeah.
No. You finish that. It's a different aspect.
Okay, so again, the capacity of receptivity for receiving receptions through the mode in which we are given by objects is entitled sensibility. So we have the intuition and the sensibility straight off the bat. Objects are given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone yields intuitions. They are thought through the understanding, and the form of the understanding arrives in concepts. I mean, that is
Yeah,
just like, if you're trying to
it's
understand
nice.
Kant, that is so important.
Yeah,
It shows you the beginnings of his
that's it.
whole,
Right.
conceptual machinery. Yeah. You have
Hmm.
these objects are given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone yields intuitions. They are thought through the understanding, and the understanding arise from concepts. And basically, his whole critique is going to be about this.
Yeah, that's also the trajectory of. If you wanna, that's his entire stance, right? This is the entire thing that Hegel is parrying against. Is
Yeah.
all this stuff. Is everything on this? Yeah, in this list.
Mm. The intuition, which is relation to the object through sensation, is empirical. The underdetermined object of the empirical intuition is entitled appearance. So here we have everything. The appearance which corresponds to sensation, I term.
Yeah, you're breaking up.
And he comes here, and then he comes in with his exterior. All right.
I didn't really hear you there. You kind of broke up.
So basically, it's just going through this idea of empirical appearance, and he comes to this idea of a posteriori and a priori. So I'm not still breaking up.
Yeah, I think you're back.
Pretty bad.
There we go. I think you're back.
Basically, he comes to this idea of posteriori priori in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this idea of art from all representations pure and transcendental sense. There is nothing that belongs to sensation. The pure form of sensible intuitions in general, in which all the manifold of intuition is intuited in certain relations, must be found in the mind, a priori. This pure form of sensibility may be called itself pure intuition.
Yeah. Yeah, he would say later that space itself cannot be found outside, right? You can only encounter it in the concept, which is very interesting.
Now, to answer your question about what he means by the aesthetic, we have it here.
Yeah.
The science of all principles of a priori sensibility I call transcendental aesthetic. And the Germans, this is Kemp's footnote, the Germans are the only people who currently make the word aesthetic in order to signify what others call the critique of taste. This usage originated in the abortive attempt made by Baumgarten, that admirable analytic thinker, to bring the critical treatment of the beautiful under rational principles. And so to raise its rules and to rank of sciences. But such endeavors are fruitless. The said rules or criteria are regarded as regards their chief sources merely empirical, and consequently can never serve as a determinate, a priori law by which our judgment of taste must be directed. On the contrary, for our judgment is the proper tastes of the correctiveness of the rule. For this reason, it is advisable either to give up using the name in the sense of critique of taste and to reserve it for that doctrine of sensibility, which is true science, thus approximating to the language and sense of the ancients in their far-framed division of knowledge, or else to share the name of speculative philosophy, employing it partly in the transcendental and partly in psychological sense.
Right. So it's speculative philosophy. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah. So in the transcendental aesthetic, we shall therefore first isolate sensibility by taking it away from everything else, which the understanding thinks through its concepts, so that nothing may be left save empirical intuition. Secondly, we shall also separate off from it everything which belongs to sensation, so that nothing may remain save pure intuition and the mere form of appearance, which is all that sensibility can supply a priori.
Yeah.
Let me see here. Okay. So yeah, so there's nothing really there to. He's just laying it
No.
out, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. It's everything we've seen before.
Transcendental
No,
aesthetic
but
space. Go on, yeah.
yeah. No, that's it clarifies. I guess it means something like yeah, yeah, it's just speculative philosophy that aesthetic what do you call it? Transcendental aesthetic. How to go from um rational concepts, right, to like how do you make a science out of this, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, metaphysical exposition of this concept. By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves
Mhm.
objects as outside of us and all without exception in space. So everything seems to come. The space seems to be a very important aspect to.
Yeah.
He basically here. In order to obtain light upon these questions, let us first give an exposition of the concept of space. So he has these several questions that he's going through here. So, we're to inner sense by means of which the mind's intuit or itself inner state yields indeed no intuition but the result of self, but nevertheless determinate. So time cannot be outwardly intuited any more than space can be intuited as something else. What then are space and time? Are they real existence? Are they only determinations, etc.? Or are space and time such that they belong only to the form of intuition? So we have to do an exposition of space here. By exposition, I mean clear through, not necessarily exhaustive, representations of which belong to the concept. The exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which exhibits space as given a priori. So space isn't an empirical concept.
No. Yeah.
Which has been
You don't even encounter space. Yeah, you just encounter objects
no,
in that you logically
yeah.
see a
The
space.
representation of space cannot therefore be empirically obtained from the relations of outer experience. On the contrary, this outer experience is itself possible only through that representation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how also the affinity between space and time is in German thinking. Yeah, since the the time of Kant, space time has been like
Yes.
interconnected. It's quite
Yeah, I
amazing,
mean, you see
honestly.
it
And
in
then
Heidegger too, yeah.
then eventually Heidegger as well, and then eventually, famously Einstein, right? The space time.
Fuck
Yeah, it's all these Germans, man. Like there is something in their way of
yeah.
thinking.
There is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, 2. Space is a necessary a priori representation, which underlies all our intuitions. We can never represent to ourselves the absence of space, though we can quite well think it as empty objects. It must therefore be regarded as the condition of possibility of appearances, and not as a determination dependent on them. It is an a priori representation which necessarily underlies our outer appearances. Okay,
Yeah.
space
So
is
it's
space. Yeah.
no. What were you gonna say? I was just finding the
We
passage.
have spaces.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is the passage here, section 2.
Yeah, I think I found it. It's 2, right? 2. Space is a necessary a priori. Yeah.
So we need space. So space, number 1, isn't an empirical concept. Second of all, space is a necessary for representation of our intuition. It is an necessary underlies appearances. Space is not discursive.
Wait, you're breaking up very bad.
Am I breaking up very bad?
Yeah. Now I can hear you again. Yeah, try again.
Am I back?
I think so.
Space is not a discursive or, as we say, general concept of relations of things in general, but a intuition. Am I gone?
Nope, you're still here.
Um, for the first place, we can represent ourselves only in one space. And if we speak of diverse spaces, we mean thereby only parts of one and the same unique space. Secondly, these parts cannot be seen or embracing space. Space is essentially one and a manifold, therefore the general concept of space depends on the limitations. Hence, it follows that an a priori and not an empirical intuition underlies all concepts of space. For kindred reasons, geometrical propositions that, for instance, in a triangle, two sides together are greater than the third can never be derived from the general concept of a line, triangle, but only from intuition, and this indeed a priori with apodictic certainty. So, any thoughts on this one?
I think space as the precondition of experience is very interesting. Space is not itself an experience; is the precondition for experience. I also like how the connection to geometry, where the intuition that we have that space is out there is like, yeah, it's like you don't get this just from pure stuff out there, much like we don't get the relationships of the two lines in a triangle from an idea of the lines. There's no object out there that we can point out as pointing to space, for instance. They're just objects. But I guess the space between, he would say that the space between them are that arise out of a internal necessity in our heads, basically.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But I also like that the concept of different spaces arise out of the concept of like a limit, like limitations. That's a very good way to think about it. There's only one space in reality.
Yes.
Yeah. That's very.
What does he mean by
profound. Yeah.
What does he mean by the manifold?
So a manifold is like if you have many aspects in one thing. Like it's like, imagine like if literally if you're folding stuff. So if space is one, and within it, it's possible all these other spaces. That's what it is. That's what a manifold is. When you have one thing, but in it there contains multiple.
Yes.
It's that is honestly very a very metaphysically profound thing to think about. Like there's only one space in being, in reality, at necessarily. It's real. Yeah.
Okay. We have 4. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. And then we have 5. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude.
Wait, what's 4?
The 4 is space represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now, every concept must be thought as a representation.
Okay, yeah.
Ad infinitum. Consequently, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition, not a concept. So why would it be an intuition? Intuition is representation of space as an a priori intuition.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm having a hard time connecting messages.
So basically here, we are here up at this one.
Yeah.
So we say space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now, every concept must be thought as a representation which is contained as an infinite number of different possible representations, which therefore contain these under itself, but no concept as such can be thought as containing an infinite number of representations within itself. It is this latter way, however, that space is thought, and all the parts of space coexist ad infinitum. Consequently, the original representation of a space is an a priori intuition, not a concept.
All the parts of space coexist. Mm-hmm. It the explanation here would be no concept as such can be thought as containing an infinite number of representation within itself. I still think this has to do with oh, I see. So that's the difference between. I think here he differentiates between intuition and concept, and concept is more determinate maybe than intuition is what perhaps what he's saying, and concept doesn't have within it. For instance, you don't have a concept where it could be anything, right? But that's
Right.
not that's a very loose kind of concept. But space is pretty much every possible,
Everything, yeah.
yeah. So all the parts of space coexist at infinitum. So I would say that that's why it's intuition and not concept. So I think he's detaching space even further from experience here.
Right.
So concepts are detached from experience, but intuitions are even more detached.
Okay.
That's how I
have
read
to
it.
think
Yeah.
over that. You make some good points. I'm going to have to mull over that. Okay, the transcendental exposition of concept of space. So I understand the transcendental exposition, the explanation of a concept as a principle from which the possibility of other a priori synthetic knowledge can be understood. So for this purpose, it is required, one, that such knowledge does really flow from the given concept, and that this knowledge is possible only as an assumption of explaining the concepts. So here we have geometry is a science which determines the properties of space synthetically and yet a priori. What then must a representation of space in order that such knowledge of it may be possible? It must in its origin be intuition. For the mere concept, no proposition can be obtained go beyond the concept, as happens in geometry. And it must be a priori. It must be found in us prior to any perception of an object, and must therefore be pure, not empirical intuition. So this is one of the big distinctions that Allison raises in his defense of Kant, that a lot of Kantian scholars don't make the distinction between the transcendental perspective and the empirical perspective. Transcendental perspective is looking at the a priori conditions for the possibility. The empirical is the actual object as it is in science.
Right. That leads to, I mean, that's this is much later, obviously, but that leads to, I think, to the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. Right, the phenomenal world is empirical, whereas the noumenon, I guess, is, I don't know. That is a kind of a given, right? So in a way, yeah.
Okay, so then we have these four geometrical propositions of a diptych that is a bound up the consciousness of their necessity. For instance, that space only has 3 dimensions. So what does he mean here by this idea of the geometrical? For geometrical propositions are one and all apodictic, that is, are bound up with the consciousness of their necessity. For instance, that space is only 3 dimensions.
Geometrical propositions are one and all apodictic. Right. So I think he's saying here that geometrical propositions are true in virtue of themselves. Like we don't see, we don't seek further. once we encounter a geometrical truth, for instance, like that's it, we stop right there, because that's the and here he's saying that
Right.
it's apodictic, that space has three dimensions.
What does he mean by apodictic?
I think that's just necessary.
Right. Okay.
If I look it up, but the here he goes. I just lost that. Here we go. So apodictic are, yeah, this bound up with the consciousness of their necessity. So if you're doing something and this thing is bound up with the internal necessity in your head, that's apodictic.
God.
Yeah,
Okay.
complicated.
Okay.
So that's
How
not
can there
empirical.
exist? How can there? How then can there exist in the mind an outer intuition which precedes the object itself? So we sort of know the object before the object is given, in a sense, and in which the concept of these objects can be determined a priori, manifestly not otherwise than insofar as the intuition has its seat in the subject only, as the formal character of the subject, in virtue of which in being affected by objects. So it obtains immediate representation, that is, the intuition of them, and only insofar, therefore, as merely from the outer point. Our explanation is thus only an explanation that makes intelligible the possibility of geometry as a body of a priori synthetic knowledge. Any mode of explanation fails to do this, although maybe others seem what similar, can by this criteria be distinguished from it with the greatest certainty.
Hmm. Wait a minute. There's a lot of very important stuff. um,
Okay, so this is the key part. That's
Yeah.
the key part. Our explanation is thus only the explanation that makes intelligible the possibility of geometry as a body of a priori synthetic knowledge. So he's saying that it is only insofar as that it is knowledge that is independent of experience, the possibility of geometry as a form of knowledge that is independent of experience, but yet at the same time, unlike Hume, it's not devoid of content. It actually is telling us content about the world. It's not just merely analytic statements that are empty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's your thoughts?
I was just trying to go through this complexity. So I guess he's saying here that he's asking how could um, the idea of the external world precedes the perception of objects,
Yes.
and the question is to be answered, I think, in looking at the possibility of
Well,
geometry.
so here, so we're bringing up geometry up here, right? So, geometry is a science which determines the property of space synthetically and yet
Yeah.
a priori. What then must be a representation of space in order that such a knowledge may be possible? It must, in its origin, be intuition. For a mere concept, no proposition can be obtained which go beyond the concept, as happens in geometry. Further, the intuition must be a priori, that must be found in us prior to a perception of an object, and we must therefore be pure, not empirical. For geometrical propositions are one and all apodictic, that is, they are bound up with the consciousness of their necessity, what you're saying. For instance, that space is only three dimensions. Such propositions cannot be empirical, or in other words, judgments of experience, nor they can be derived from any such judgments. So they have to be from the transcendental perspective. They have to be put, as he says here, how can there exist in the mind an outer intuition in which precedes the objects and in which the concepts of the objects can be determined a priori? Manifestly, not otherwise than insofar as the intuition has the seat in the subject, only insofar as a formal character subject, in virtue which, in being affected by object, it obtains immediate representations, that is, intuition of them, and only insofar as, therefore, as it is merely the form of outer sense in general. And then he comes in here to clarify we're only looking at the possibility of geometry.
Right.
So the answer that he gives to this, how did the exist in the mind? So he's talking about the intuition and the seat of the subject only as a formal character.
Yeah. So the hmm. Like I think at the very least he's saying that the reason why geometry is intelligible to us also grounds our intuition of outer sense.
And he's saying
He's
that
saying that
such
this
propositions,
just appears when an object hits us or something, when an object
yes,
appears before us, and then
yes.
yeah. But this
So
is
he says
not in
here,
the in
um,
itself. It's just in your head.
he says it here. He says, manifestly, not otherwise, then insofar as the intuition has the seat in the subject only as the formal
Yeah.
character of the subject in virtue, which in being affected by objects, exactly, it
Right.
obtains immediate representations, that is, intuitions of them. So
Right.
it gets this knowledge by being receptive. And it's not empirical. Such propositions
It's not.
cannot be empirical, or in other words, judgments of experience, nor can they be derived from any such judgments. These are, in other words, our explanation is thus an explanation, only an explanation that makes intelligible the possibility of geometry, not geometry itself. And we
Yeah.
cannot derive the possibility of geometry from geometry as being an empirical subject itself. We're looking at the conditions for the possibility of geometry being something that we can study.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, Kant is a lot more interesting after all the preamble. Like this is far more. there's, there's more
That's
teeth to this.
it's
Yeah,
amazing. I mean, what he's doing, he's
yeah.
saying,
It's very tedious, but
like, I
it's,
mean,
it's good stuff.
yeah, the logic is. Let's just look over the logic of this.
Yeah.
So let's take something like, I don't know, biology,
Mhm.
and we substitute it for geometry. Can I justify my study of, or justify or find the conditions for the possibility of my studying biology from studying biology itself? Or do I have to look deeper into the fundamental foundations of science or philosophy to give a justification of it?
Hmm. Yeah, it's very complicated because I think biology is empirical, right? Whereas geometry
Yes.
is both synthetic and a priori. So
Yes.
this is why it's unique, right? So you can't really compare this with some other thing.
No.
I don't know. But
So he's saying here, geometry is a science which determines the properties of space synthetically,
hmm.
yet a priori.
So it's I guess synthetic because you do need to experience it, but it's a priori because if you want to find the truth of it, it would not be in the lines, or in the whatever. It would be
No.
in the mind. So that's why it's a priori.
Yes, it's
And
independent
yeah,
of experience, but yes, it gives us content of this is amazing.
yeah.
Getting them sort of Hegelian trips. Reading that.
We
Talking about
really
geometry of all things.
yeah. We really did this backwards. We really should read this before Hegel. This is
Hegel, yeah.
yeah, but it's good
He's,
though. It's
he's,
interesting,
he's, he's really good. Okay,
yeah.
conclusions from the above concept.
Right?
Space does not represent any property of things in themselves,
Right.
nor does it represent them in their relation to one another.
hmm
For no determination, whether absolute or relative, can be intuitive a priori to the existence of things to which they belong, and none, therefore, can be intuited a priori.
Yeah, yeah. I really love also how he talks about the property of the mind. Being we have an outer sense and an inner sense.
Yes.
That's a very interesting. That's when I was writing the Hegel paper, I really struggled with that very question. Like how do you talk about outer and inner sense in terms of the mind? And well, it's a property of the mind. That's very brilliant, honestly. It's an
Yeah.
aspect of the mind. Yeah.
Okay, so B, space, is nothing but the form of all appearances of outer space.
Mhm.
It is the subjective condition of sensibility under which alone outer intuition is possible for us. Since then, the receptivity of the subject, its capacity to be affected by objects, must necessarily precede all intuitions of these objects.
Mhm.
It can be readily be understood how the form of all appearances can be given a priori, which determine the relations of these objects. It is therefore solely from the human standpoint that we can speak of space, of extended things. So how does that derive from that? So we have...
Yeah, because space itself doesn't. Space is possibility, is the form of appearance in the mind. So outside of the experience, outside of a viewpoint, there is no space, I guess.
Right. Yeah, space is the condition for the possibility of not
Right,
partially the condition for the
right.
possibility of experience. Okay.
Yeah, space is instantiated by us.
Yes.
That's very mind blowing, to think that
It is, yeah.
there's no
We can't
space.
we cannot think outside of space, basically.
Right. Yeah, it's just the form of
Um,
our appearance.
okay. Our exposition therefore establishes the reality that the objective validity of space is in respect to whatever can be represented to us outwardly as object, but also at the same time the ideality of space respect to things when they are considered in themselves. Through reason, that is, without regard to the constitution of our society. Okay. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the objective validity of space in respect to whatever can be represented as object. Hmm. Yeah, but this is still like, I love how Kant needs to still maintain like, oh yeah, it's real, just because it's inside your head. Like there's an objectivity to this. Yeah.
Right.
To,
There's an intersubjective objectivity.
right. So that's why after that he says that there is an empirical reality to space as well, and then the transcendental reality. Because on the one hand, it is
Okay.
real. Like it's real because the objects. There is like I guess something that hits you. Oops, disappear. Wait, is this still live? Am I alone live? That's horrible. There we go.
Jason's still there.
That you're really breaking up. Yeah, the internet is not happy today. You still there?
Oh, you're back.
Yo. There we go. Yeah, I've been here.
Okay, so I probably dropped out. Crappy
Yeah.
internet. Anyway, in Allison's book, there is this distinction between, or the idea that transcendental idealism gives, if I'm correct, rise to empirical realism. And empirical idealism is transcendental realism.
Could you repeat that again? That's interesting.
Empirical realism
Hmm.
is transcendental idealism. Transcendental realism is empirical idealism.
Transcendental realism is empirical
No,
idealism.
is
What?
empirical idealism. Yeah, you've got it. Yeah. I will send
Hmm.
you some stuff on
Yeah.
this now.
Could you
Again,
explain that? That's because
I
yeah.
will explain this next time
Okay.
because I don't want to butcher it. So, um,
No, that's very cool. Yeah.
very very interesting. What we can do is we can tease this out definitely next time,
Yeah.
and we will do some. I'll send you some stuff
Yeah.
over so
No,
we
what's
can
crazy
confirm it.
is that these philosophers they really hardly disagree, I think, at the end of the day. Like
Mm.
the empiricists and the idealists, they're talking about the same thing, I think, basically. Just different
Yeah.
emphasis.
Yeah. Okay then.
There's
So we have with sole exception of space, there is no subjective representation referring to something outer which could be entitled at one subjective and a priori. That's very interesting, isn't it?
Mhm. Yeah.
With the sole exception of space, there is no subjective representation referring to something outer.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. This is why space is also not you can't find
Okay,
space in objects. There's nothing that says in object space. Like that's something that already comes.
so space is the limiting factor for the phenomena, and anything beyond space is in the pneuma.
Mm, yeah, I would say like space is one intuition in
Yes,
which because there's also time, right? Um, yeah, and outside of that would be the noumena, exactly. Because
well, you said
because space
historically speaking.
space doesn't
Go
real
on, yeah.
space. Yeah, here's the thing that like space is fundamentally not real, right? In this paradigm, in this point of view, the noumenon is
Well,
real.
I think it's the big question of what's reality for Kant.
Yeah,
He is space is real in a certain respect that is
it
different
is.
to
Yeah,
the noumena that is real in a certain respect.
right.
It's like they're two different. It's
Yeah, there are
difference, but
different
it's still
senses.
reality.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Strictly speaking, therefore, these other representations have no ideality, although they agree with the representation of space in this respect. They belong merely to the subjective constitution of our manner of sensibility, sight, hearing, touch, as in the case of the sensations, colours, sounds, and heat, which, since they are mere sensations, not intuitions, do not of themselves yield any knowledge of an object, least any a priori.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why something like biology or something can't be talked about like this. The geometry
Yeah.
can't. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. That's basically it. Any last comments
Space.
there or any?
No. This was, he leaves nothing to mystery. It seems, it's everything. He's a very concise writer.
I mean, I think we could have gone over that with even more detail and got more stuff out of it, but I think
I guess so. That's true. But what I mean is that he lays
yeah,
out his cards. Like that's everything is on the table
yeah,
right now.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel with Kant similar to Hegel. I mean, you really have to get in and understand their language to like. I mean, you have to
Yeah.
like even
Yeah.
that idea. You're sort of understanding their geography, their topology,
Yeah.
their
Absolutely.
abstract topology. I mean,
Yeah.
um, it would be very interesting to read like contemporary Kantians like Nicolai or Sloterdijk and
Does
see what
Ligland identify as a Kantian?
he was a Kant scholar, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Makes
And it would
sense.
be interesting to see the Kant that has survived through Hegel, Fichte,
Right.
you know, Heidegger. Um, very
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I wish I knew more about this. This is very interesting. I feel like Hegel and Kant is definitely the gateway into like these kind of big boys, you know, in philosophy. This
Exactly. Yeah,
is this
exactly.
the current movements. Yeah,
All right. So next time we'll do time.
time. Look at that. All the grand concepts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to
All
end
right.
this broadcast.
All right. Perfect.
Till next
Uh,
time, guys. And